Part II, Chapter 21 of the Fur Country. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Fur Country by Jules Verne. Chapter 21. The Island Becomes an Islet. 3 hours later the last relics of the ice wall had disappeared, proving that the island now remained stationary, and that all the force of the current was deep down below the waves, not on the surface of the sea. The bearings were taken at noon with the greatest care, and 24 hours later it was found that Victoria Island had not advanced 1 mile. The only remaining hope was that some vessel should sight the poor shipwrecked creatures, either whilst still on the island or after they had taken to their raft. The island was now in 54 degrees 33 minutes latitude and 177 degrees 19 minutes longitude, several hundred miles from the nearest land, namely the Aleutian Islands. Hobson once more called his comrades together, and asked them what they thought it would be best to do. All agreed that they should remain on the island until it broke up, as it was too large to be affected by the state of the sea, and only to take to the raft when the dissolution actually commenced. Once on the frail vessel they must wait, still wait. The raft was now finished. Mac Nab had made one large shed or cabin, big enough to hold every one, and to afford some little shelter from the weather. A mast had been prepared, which could be put up if necessary, and the sails intended for the boat had long been ready. The whole structure was strong, although clumsy, and if the wind were favourable and the sea not too rough, this rude assortment of planks and timbers might save the lives of the whole party. "Nothing," observed Mrs Barnett, "nothing is impossible to Him who rules the winds and the waves." Hobson carefully looked over the stores of provisions. The reserves had been much damaged by the avalanche, but there were plenty of animals still on the island, and the abundant shrubs and mosses supplied them with food. A few reindeer and hares were slaughtered by the hunters, and their flesh salted for future needs. The health of the colonists was on the whole good. They had suffered little in the preceding mild winter, and all the mental trials they had gone through had not affected their physical well-being. They were, however, looking forward with something of a shrinking horror to the moment when they should have to abandon their island home, or, to speak more correctly, when it abandoned them. It was no wonder that they did not like the thought of floating on the ocean in a rude structure of wood, subject to all the caprices of winds and waves. Even in tolerably fine weather seas would be shipped, and every one constantly drenched with salt water. Moreover, it must be remembered that the men were none of them sailors, accustomed to navigation, and ready to risk their lives on a few planks, but soldiers trained for service on land. Their island was fragile, it is true, and rested on a thin crust of ice, but then it was covered with a productive soil. Trees and shrubs flourished upon it. Its huge bulk rendered it insensible to the motion of the waves, and it might have been supposed to be stationary. They had in fact become attached to Victoria Island, on which they had lived nearly 2 years. Every inch of the ground had become familiar to them. They had tilled the soil, and had come safely through so many perils in their wandering home, that in leaving it they felt as if they were parting from an old and sorely tried friend. Hobson fully sympathized with the feeling of his men, and understood their repugnance to embarking on the raft. But then he also knew that the catastrophe could not now be deferred much longer, and ominous symptoms already gave warning of its rapid approach. We will now describe this raft. It was 30 feet square, and its deck rose 2 feet above the water. Its bulwarks would therefore be kept out of the small but not the large waves. In the centre the carpenter had built a regular deck-house, which would hold some 20 people. Round it were large lockers for the provisions and water casks, all firmly fixed to the deck with iron bolts. The mast, 30 feet high, was fastened to the deck-house, and strengthened with stays attached to the corners of the raft. The mast was to have a square sail, which would only be useful when the wind was aft. A sort of rudder was fixed to this rough structure, the fittings of which were necessarily incomplete. Such was the raft constructed by the head carpenter, on which 21 persons were to embark. It was floating peacefully on the little lake, strongly moored to the shore. It was certainly constructed with more care than if it had been put together in haste on a vessel at sea doomed to immediate destruction. It was stronger and better fitted up, but after all it was but a raft. On the 1st June a new incident occurred. Hope, one of the soldiers, went to fetch some water from the lake for culinary purposes, and when Mrs Joliffe tasted it, she found that it was salt. She called Hope, and said she wanted fresh, not salt water. The man replied that he had brought it from the lake as usual, and as he and Mrs Joliffe were disputing about it, the Lieutenant happened to come in. Hearing Hope's repeated assertions that he had fetched the water from the lake, he turned pale, and hurried to the lagoon. The waters were quite salt. The bottom of the lake had evidently given way, and the sea had flowed in. The fact quickly became known, and every one was seized with a terrible dread. "No more fresh water!" exclaimed all the poor creatures together. Lake Barnett had in fact disappeared, as Paulina River had done before. Lieutenant Hobson hastened to reassure his comrades about drinkable water. "There will be plenty of ice, my friends," he said. "We can always melt a piece of our island, and," he added with ghastly attempt at a smile, "I don't suppose we shall drink it all." It is, in fact, well known that salt separates from sea water in freezing and evaporation. A few blocks of ice were therefore disinterred, if we may so express it, and melted for daily use, and to fill the casks on board the raft. It would not do, however, to neglect this fresh warning given by nature. The invasion of the lake by the sea proved that the base of the island was rapidly melting. At any moment the ground might give way, and Hobson forbade his men to leave the factory, as they might be drifted away before they were aware of it. The animals seemed more keenly alive than ever to approaching danger. They gathered yet more closely round the firmer part, and after the disappearance of the fresh-water lake they came to lick the blocks of ice. They were all uneasy, and some seemed to be seized with madness, especially the wolves, who rushed wildly towards the factory, and dashed away again, howling piteously. The furred animals remained huddled together round the large well where the principal house had formerly stood. There were several hundreds of them, of different species, and the solitary bear roamed backwards and forwards, showing no more hostility to the quadrupeds than to men. The number of birds, which had hitherto been considerable, now decreased. During the last few days all those capable of long sustained flight, such as swans, etc., migrated towards the Aleutian Islands in the south, where they would find a sure refuge. This significant and ominous fact was noted by Mrs Barnett and Madge, who were walking together on the beach. "There is plenty of food for these birds on the island," observed Mrs Barnett, "and yet they leave it. They have good reason, no doubt." "Yes," replied Madge, "their instinct of self-preservation makes them take flight, and they give us a warning by which we ought to profit. The animals also appear more uneasy than usual." Hobson now decided to take the greater part of the provisions and all the camping apparatus on board the raft, and when that was done, to embark with the whole party. The sea was, however, very rough, and the waters of the former lake, now a kind of Mediterranean in miniature, were greatly agitated. The waves, confined in the narrow space, dashed mountains high, and broke violently upon the steep banks. The raft tossed up and down, and shipped sea after sea. The embarkation of provisions, etc., had to be put off. Every one wished to pass one more quiet night on land, and Hobson yielded against his better judgment, determined, if it were calmer the next day, to proceed with the embarkation. The night was more peaceful than had been expected. The wind went down, and the sea became calmer. It had but been swept by one of those sudden and brief hurricanes peculiar to these latitudes. At 8 o'clock in the evening the tumult ceased, and a slight surface agitation of the waters of the lake and sea alone remained. It was some slight comfort that the island would not now be broken up suddenly, as it must have done had the storm continued. Its dissolution was, of course, still close at hand, but would not, it was hoped, be sudden and abrupt. The storm was succeeded by a slight fog, which seemed likely to thicken during the night. It came from the north, and owing to the changed position of the island, would probably cover the greater part of it. Before going to bed, Hobson went down and examined the moorings of the raft, which were fastened to some strong birch trees. To make security doubly sure, he tightened them, and the worst that could now happen would be that the raft would drift out on to the lagoon, which was not large enough to be lost upon it. CHAPTER 22.